you realize this is bad for Chad and for the people of Chad, and you say, wait a minute, we changed our mind. All of a sudden, you're staring down the barrel of a very big Chinese gun, and they'll say, no, you're not, and this is the way it's going to be, and what are you going to do about it? They don't have the ability to defend themselves against an overwhelming force like that. And this is all part of the way that empires rise and fall. And the trouble with current leadership in Washington, as well as Canada, but to a much smaller role, much smaller way, is that if you don't maintain your top of the heap position, then somebody's going to come and knock you off, and they aren't always going to be your best friend. So that's where you have a situation developing here with China, and it's ever growing. And it's not just the Navy they're rebuilding; they're doing it all through all three branches of their military. Everything from the new stealth fighter to new weapons for the Army and so on. These guys are going at it hammer and tong, and I think the world has better sit up and pay attention to what China's doing, not only what it's doing, but why it's doing it, because it's expensive to maintain an army or a military of that size. It's why after World War II we had to what they call demob or demobilize, because an economy like Canada's or the United States, for that matter, could not afford to keep an army the size that we had or a military that we had at the end of the war in the field. It's just too expensive. And China has justified this expansion knowing things that we don't. And that's another reason to be a little bit worried about this.
Now, you touched on, I think, a really important principle I just want to circle back on, Nick, and that is a foreign contributions or foreign donations to foreign countries or helping them out financially. This is something that the Chinese have really stepped up as well, and it's important to remember. We tend in this part of the world, in the Western world, to be reluctant to provide foreign aid, and I understand the desire to provide services at home first, and I certainly don't object to that. But I think it's important to also remember that our enemies are buying support, buying alliances with countries out there that we are refusing to provide financial support to, foreign aid to. And the Chinese have been doing this, I think, very successfully. And it's one of the reasons why you cannot really ignore foreign aid. You cannot really say, we're not going to provide foreign aid in our budget, because there are most countries in the world, I think, still would fall under the category of developing, and they need financial assistance in order to move forward in their domestic development, social programs, health, food, water, agriculture, you name it, in building their economies and providing for their people. And the Chinese have been very, very liberal in providing that kind of support and in filling what is, in some areas, has been a gap in the support that we in the West give to these countries. And the consequence of that is twofold. Number one, you're buying friendship, okay, and you're buying goodwill, but you're also tying the economies of these smaller countries to your own fate. And so it becomes a situation where a country like, for instance, you use Chad as an example. I don't know to what degree the Chinese are into Chad from a finance point of view, but let's say that they're in a major way, and something happens in Central Africa, and we need a country like Chad to be supportive of what we're trying to do domestically, or not domestically, but we're trying to do diplomatically. And the Chinese oppose it And perhaps the government of Chad is very supportive of us. But if the Chinese sorry, we need you to be on our side, and if you're not going to be on our side, we're going to have to reconsider all of the loans and the grants, etc., that we've been providing you with. So it's a very, very, very powerful way of creating alliances, even if you're not signing treaties.
Well, it's the same thing that, and again, I'm going back to the beginning of the 20th century, that nations did amongst themselves, not only just signing treaties. There was the famous, was it the Ribbentrop Pact between Germany and Russia, where Russia would supply, coal
right.
and things like that.
1939.
They would continue even after the beginning of Barbarossa for about 3 or 4 days. They kept sending coal into Germany. There's other examples of that. The Germans tried to work out a deal with Mexico to attack the United States from the south. Countries play off against each other historically, especially when they know that it's in the foreseeable future, it's likely going to have to face the country they're trying to undermine or not antagonize, but undermine is probably the best word. So when you think about that, do you really want, how do you go about, because foreign aid, a lot of objections to foreign aid are centered around the idea, well, if you give it to this tin pot dictator over there in, whatever land, be it in the Middle East or in Africa or whatever it is, or Central America, they're just going to spend it either on their military or on a new gold car or whatever, and the people you're trying to help with it are never going to see it. Okay, so that's been the typical resistance, but from what I'm hearing you talk about, and I hadn't really considered this, I'm kind of thinking off the top of my head, what's that old saying about the devil you know versus the devil you don't? Maybe it's a mistake on our part to be quite that rigid when it comes to dealing with some of these countries, or maybe if we take it in a different approach than just financial, we might be living in a little bit different world today. But right now, what we have are the Chinese using that mindset to further goals that are not good for anybody but China.
Right. And, I'm not suggesting that, we have to give these, as you say, tin pot dictators a blank check, but I think that we have to be far more circumspect in our approach to foreign aid, because, there are just times, well, look, again, the best example, Nick, as we get ready to go for a break, you raised the question of the Ribbentrop pact with Russia, with the Soviet Union, and you were quite right to raise that. But after the Soviet Union was invaded by the Germans, they became key allies of us in the West in defeating National Socialist Germany. And there's a very real question as to whether or not we would have been able to win the war if, in fact, the Soviets had not come in, if the Germans had not attacked the Soviet Union. I think that's a very interesting and a very open question. So, and let's face it, the Soviet Union was not, Stalin was not a wallflower. He was a brutal, sadistic dictator, responsible for the deaths of millions of his fellow countrymen
and others. Yeah,
but it was still important for us to set that aside and deal with, as I like to always say, you have to deal with the world the way it really is. And at that point in time in history, it was Nazi Germany that was the greater threat to international peace and stability, and they had to be beaten. And in order to beat them, we had to make common cause with a brutal, ugly, evil dictatorship, and we did. And the world ended up being a better place for it. So it's not black and white, and it's just we have to keep these things in mind when we're determining what our policy is. Ladies and gentlemen, see, it's the bottom of the hour. We're going to go for a quick break. We'll be back in a few minutes here on the Nick and Joe Show. If you're listening live, stay put. If you're listening to the podcast, thanks for listening, and join us for part 4 tomorrow morning on the Nick and Joe Show from ThinkRadio.ca.